Hello and welcome to this Gresham lecture, which I've entitled Tackling Knife Violence Through Simulation. My name is Roger Kneebone. I'm Professor of Surgical Education and Engagement Science at Imperial College London and Gresham College Visiting Professor of Medical Education. So at Imperial College London, I lead the Centre for Engagement and Simulation Science, where our emphasis is on advancing human health through simulation. I lead another centre too, which is the Centre for Performance Science, jointly between Imperial, where I'm based, and the Royal College of Music, one of our close next-door neighbours. And there, our emphasis is on looking at what it means to perform and what comes into view if we think about areas of expert practice as instances of performance. And over the last 3 years, I've given a series of lectures which I've entitled Performing Medicine, Performing Surgery, which have looked from various different perspectives at what it is to perform in the world of medicine. And in this evening's lecture, I'm going to look at a topic that I've been fascinated with and been working on for a number of years now, but also very disturbed by, which is the issue of knife violence. And of course, as we're all too much aware, every day brings another set of injuries, often tragically deaths of usually young people brought about through knife injury. We see it on the news, online, everywhere we look. And it's becoming more and more of a problem, and more tragedies surround us every day, it seems. But of course, it's not a new problem. It's been around for a very long time. And so I'm going to start my lecture by taking you back to my own experience in the 1980s. In the first stage of my career, when I was training as a general and a trauma surgeon, and I spent a number of years in Southern Africa. I'm actually going to start with a health warning because I'm going to show some images that are quite graphic, which I don't do in order to upset people, but just to give a sense of the kind of work that I encountered at that time and see how that plays out now. So I was working in Southern Africa in Soweto on the outskirts of Johannesburg, which at that time was one of the most violent parts of the world. This is looking out over Soweto, which had a population nobody knew exactly because there were no precise census figures, but well over 1 million people. And there was really one large hospital called Baragwanath, now called Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, which was the main hospital for all those people. And there was very, very high incidence of knife injury, knives, what were called pangas, kind of like machetes, and other kinds of penetrating trauma, as it was called. And so when I was working at this hospital for several years, I would be taking it in turns to man what was called the surgical pit. This is a view of the surgical pit, and you can see patients covered with orange blankets on stretchers who've been triaged. They've been assessed by other people as needing surgical care, very often urgent surgical care. And then those patients, we'd take them in through that white door in the middle of the picture and resuscitate them, and then very often have to take them to the operating theatre. And there I encountered the kind of injury that I really hadn't seen at all in the UK, where I'd been a medical student and done my initial hospital training in the Midlands. And so patients like this came in with a variety of different wounds. I learned very quickly that it was almost impossible to predict from seeing somebody's wound the extent or the kind of injury they would have suffered, but they very often needed surgical operations. And so here I am in those days, on the right of the picture, as you see it, leading a surgical team as an assistant opposite me, an anaesthetist, a scrub nurse, many other members of the team, providing immediate care to somebody who has come in seriously injured, often critically ill. In this case, the patient had a stab wound into the chest, into the heart, in fact, but it went deep into the abdominal cavity, and so he's had to have an incision that goes through the chest into the abdominal cavity, allowing us to get access to the organs inside. And then, of course, after that initial stage of an operation to find out what's wrong and try and put it right, patients were looked after by other members of the team. So you can see that the team is beginning to widen from those people we saw standing around the operating table to the nurses and the many other people involved in the care of a patient who's been injured. And this is the post-intake ward round, where there might be perhaps 150, 160 patients after a busy night on call, looked after very ably, but by a small number, usually only 3 or 4 nurses. So it seems to me that we can look at what's going on here from several different perspectives. Of course, there is scientific knowledge. That's essential. Of course, there are people with specific skills. Those are also essential. But there is also, I think, performance, and the patients, particularly, who are being looked after, experience how that performance takes place. And I think that the practice of medicine in general, and particularly surgery, happens at an intersection between those different circles, if you like. Now, the part of the picture that I was often sort of only incompletely aware of in the bits of the pathway I've shown you so far was the personality, the individuality of the patients I was operating on, because very often when I first saw them, they were unconscious or so critically ill that they needed to be rushed straight to the operating theatre. But of course, after that, I would gradually get to know them a bit. This is the young man I showed you earlier. You can see that he's got this wound which is beginning to heal up, a bag on the side of his tummy, which we'll talk more about later on. And then as he recovered, getting to know him a bit, but only a bit, because it was a very busy environment and we had many patients to look after. And so when patients like this man here, who recovered fairly quickly because he was young and fit, when he went home back into Soweto, to the community he came from, I would seldom, if ever, see patients like him again. So the work that I was doing was very much seeing people who came in seriously injured, operating on them, getting them to the first stage of their story after the surgery, and then they would leave. And I often felt uncomfortable because I felt I was only really seeing part of a much bigger picture. 30 years later, I came back to, I'd been back in the UK for a long time. By that time, I'd changed direction. I'd actually become a GP. And I became more and more interested in how clinicians learn how to do the work that they need to do to look after their patients. And I started to develop an interest in simulation, in creating environments where no patient could actually get hurt if things went wrong, but where clinicians could learn to work together to bring their different perspectives into providing care, especially with patients who were injured, where the picture was complex. And so I'm going to show you a brief glimpse of a simulation we developed of what happens when a patient comes into hospital, in this case in central London, and you'll see that there are many people in the picture. There are paramedics, there are anaesthetists, there are surgeons, there are nurses, there are all kinds of people, and they're trying to work together, well, they are working together in conditions of complexity to try and make sense of a situation that is not yet completely clear. So let's join them as the patient is brought into the hospital.
We've been involved in a fight with locals that hold the board is a precaution, but everyone seems to be normal, clear. BP's normal, pulse is slightly elevated, and breath elevated as well. No asthma, diabetes.
Okay. So he's got quite a nasty stab wound here on the abdomen.
So we've seen a team of people trying to make sense of a patient where what's going on isn't entirely clear. We know that the patient has been injured, he's got a stab wound, we know that he's alive and he's conscious, but we don't know how seriously ill. And so all those people you saw are trying to make sense of how all, and piece all this together. So they're making observations, they're doing tests, they're trying to get a sense of what's happening and decide what to do next. And in this case, what needs to happen next is the patient needs an operation. So we pick up the story in the operating theatre. Again, a simulation, but a very realistic recreation of what you would find in an operating theatre.
Quite a lot of blood in here.
So the lead surgeon here is trying to make sense again of what's happening surgically.
On myself with the suction, I need
And you can see that she's working in a team. She's got people around her. We see her over there on the left of the picture. Opposite her is her assistant. There's a scrub nurse. There are other members of the surgical team. In the distance over there, you see the anaesthetic colleagues, and there are other people as well. And at this stage, they too are trying to make sense of a situation whose details they couldn't fully understand until they started the procedure. And then once they've sorted that out, a different kind of work takes place where they are able to focus on what they've identified as the problem. It might involve stopping bleeding, it might involve taking out bits of intestine, perhaps joining things together, doing all kinds of things that depend on the nature of the injury. And so in these pictures, I've tried to give a sense of what it's like if you're a member of a surgical team. And in a while, we'll talk much more about what it's like when you're a patient. But so far, looking at what goes on when you're a clinician is something that I've tried to explore with my colleagues through the idea of simulation. Simulation as a means of creating an environment where you can experience what would happen in an actual clinical situation, but without the danger of anybody getting damaged if people make mistakes or things don't go according to plan. And at the time I was doing this, there was a big focus on simulation centres, places that had been built specially to allow clinicians to come together to practice the kind of thing I've talked about, often with mannequins like this one here that allowed people to go through some of the motions of examining a patient or collecting clinical information, and indeed for doing things in teams. But one of the issues was that these involved centres which were very resource-intensive, they were expensive to set up, there weren't very many of them, and it was quite difficult for people to get access to them. So with my colleagues, I started to look at possible alternatives, other ways we might look at giving people the experience of doing things without putting patients at risk. And I'm going to show you 3 examples. The first one we called hybrid simulation. And this was a way of making procedures like, in this case, a group of nurses putting in stitches, learning to put in stitches into a wound in somebody's skin using an oblong skin pad, making that more realistic, because when you have to do that with a patient, of course, there is the patient, you need to talk to them, you need to explain what's going on, they might ask you questions. And so we came up with the idea of attaching one of these skin pads to the arm of a patient, a healthy person, in this case, covering up the gap, so that it wasn't so obvious that the skin pad wasn't part of that patient. And then we began to work with experts from film and television prosthetics to create more sophisticated models that you could attach to a healthy person so that it looked pretty convincingly as if that person had an injury or an illness. So we developed various approaches to simulating road traffic accidents, it might be, or fractures, all kinds of different injuries that were sufficiently realistic to make clinicians believe that they were actually in a clinical situation. The next thing we wanted to do was to try and widen out accessibility to simulation so that people didn't have to go only to scarce, expensive simulation centres, because although those are very useful if you can get at them, a lot of people couldn't get at them. And we wanted something that would allow us to move simulation around, to take it to where people needed it to be, rather than expecting them to come to it, and something that could be folded up and put in the back of a car and taken around. So working with a couple of design engineers, we came up with the idea of an inflatable operating theatre environment, a simulation that you could fold away and then put up somewhere else, that just had 1 or 2 cues in it, 1 or 2 props that made you think it was like an operating theatre. And it turned out that those were surprisingly convincing. So this example I showed you a little bit earlier of a surgical team is actually taking place in one of those simulated inflatable operating theatres. But because the team is working as teams do in real life, it gives that sense of being actually there. And then the third one we developed was the idea of sequential simulation, of a series of steps in a pathway of care, which in this case might start with the patient being stabbed and coming into hospital with a stab wound like that, being assessed by a consultant, the operation of the kind that I've just shown you, and then perhaps picking up the story a bit later on as the patient's wound was starting to heal, And so we started thinking about how we might present a sequence of steps that would allow us to look more widely at what was going on in this area of penetrating injury. And then we changed our focus again, and instead of focusing on clinicians, we explored what possibilities there might be to take this out to wider groups of people, to young people, to adults, to people who had nothing to do with the world of medicine particularly, but to explain to them what went on. And this project, Life on a Knife Edge, was something we did at the National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham several years ago at the Big Bang Fair, which is a public engagement event, a big fair for children and young people. Young people, parents, teachers, about 65 or 70,000 people would come through this exhibition over the course of 3 days, and we were very fortunate in being invited to present our work in part of the medical section. So what I'm going to show you now is a sequential simulation of what happens when a young man is stabbed. We're going to see a large space with many, many members of the public, adults, children, standing around watching as a sequence of events unfolds. We're going to see this young man as he is stabbed, and then we show very briefly moments in what happens next. We see him being, see the police being called, we see him being treated by the roadside assistants, ambulance paramedics, take him to their ambulance, then to hospital, and then beyond, where we pick up a different part of the story, which is going to be the focus of the next part of my talk. But to give you your bearings, I'm just going to show you a brief 2-minute clip of what happened. And I want you to look at the way that the members of the public are engaging with what's going on, and particularly the different people from different parts of the system who come in and out of view. And when you see a policeman or an ambulance paramedic or a surgeon or an anaesthetist, that is actually what they do in real life. So it gives that sense of authenticity. So let's join them as we just start when the patient has been stabbed. So now we've got to the point where the ambulance paramedics have taken the patient into their ambulance, and we're going to fast forward to the point where the patient has been taken into hospital, has been assessed by the clinicians, and needs to have an operation. As we join the surgical team here, you can see that we have the surgeon, the lead surgeon over there in the middle of the picture. Opposite her is her first assistant, who is a young person, a member of the audience, who's been invited to come and put on a gown and gloves, take part as a member of the surgical team. On the right of the picture, we see the anaesthetist, on the left, the scrub nurse, and then all around you can see there are members of the public watching what's going on, getting a sense of what it involves.
Swab, please. Blood pressure's low. Okay, I'm not surprised. There's an awful lot of bleeding in here. Okay, we need to get to the bottom of this bleeding because it's getting more and more unstable. So I'm just going to look through the bowel, see if I can find...
So far, then, we've looked at this scenario from a clinician's point of view. But now we're going to pick the story up when something different happens. We're going to pick the story up the following morning when the patient has woken up from his anaesthetic. He's in his hospital bed. His mother has come to see him. And the surgeon who did his operation has come to explain that although she was able to save his life, she had to do something that nobody expected. She had to bring out a part of his intestine as a stoma, a colostomy, a bag for collecting his poo. And this is something that can have an absolutely devastating effect on somebody who isn't expecting it. And we're going to join them just at the moment when the surgeon is explaining to them what she had to do.
The things that I talked to your mum about before the operation yesterday was the possibility of having to bring out a colostomy, which is actually what we have to do. Is that the bag thing? Yeah, it's the bag thing. So it's a diversion. I'll show you what it looks like. This is a bit of your bowel.
And so there's the colostomy. It's a simulation, of course, but it gives a very strong sense of the kind of life-changing consequences that knife injury can have. But we didn't want people just to watch. We wanted people to come and get a sense of what was going on and get a clearer picture of what was involved here. So we invited the young people who were watching to come along and explore. And then we asked them to come and talk to us, to get to know some of our team, and to write down their thoughts on our ambulance there. So we were using simulation as a means of engaging with members of the public about something which we hope those members of the public hadn't experienced at first hand, although I'm sure some of them had. But it was a different group of people from the next stage of our work, which was to start to work more with people who had direct first-hand experience of being involved with knife violence, or knowing people who had, or being in a world where that was a constant possibility. We're going to take you now to Haggerston Park in Hackney in London, where a number of colleagues of mine and I developed a way of taking out the simulation that I've just shown you into a public space. So this turquoise van here has within it what we needed to put up that marquee, with an operating theatre of the kind I've just shown you. We had the same scenario, although different actors playing these roles, and we invited a group of young people from schools where knife violence was a particular problem, and we showed them a similar scenario to the one that I've just described. And I think you can see from this picture that the young people were absolutely transfixed by what was going on, not only by looking and seeing the effects of that operation, but by having the opportunity to explore and to talk and to ask questions. And we also invited a number of people who had experienced this kind of injury themselves, who could take part in the conversation. And the questions the young people asked they weren't so much technical things. In fact, they were hardly at all about technical things about surgery. They were questions about the colostomy. Can I go swimming? How long will it last? Can I have sex? What do I tell my girlfriend? How long is it going to last? Is it going to hurt? That sort of thing. And those were questions that you would ask if it was something that happened to you or somebody you knew or might happen to you, which I think raises an interesting issue about how we think about the implications of knife violence, because a lot of the time, a lot of what's written is written in the form of scientific papers, very important, very, very illuminating often, and very helpful from one perspective. And so, for example, this paper that was published last year looks in a very interesting way at causes of knife violence. It identifies adverse childhood experiences, poor mental health, risk factors in society, economic inequality, discrimination, all these words which can be helpful, but they only give part of the story. And so I want now to change gear and give you instead a glimpse of an insider's perspective and read to you an experience that one of the young people we've been working with told us. We've made sure that he's anonymous, but I want to just read to you his account of what it was like. Feeling under threat, he says, like you need to protect yourself, is a big part of carrying a knife, big part. That's like the biggest part. It makes you feel safer. I mean, it puts you in danger, but you feel safer. Truly, you don't even realize what's happening. It's like the pack mentality. You stop thinking for yourself almost. You get caught up in just like the madness. The second time I was stabbed, I was in my early 20s. It was kind of mad. It was mad because it just happened so quick. Like in a matter of seconds, everything was done. You're thinking so fast, your adrenaline is pumping. I was in hospital for a long time. I was in a coma for weeks. I had like 8 operations. I had infections. I had so much go wrong. The hospital was scarier than the actual incident. I had to get a stoma bag. Oh, the stoma bag was the worst. Colostomy bag, I mean. Imagine, when I was eventually able to walk around and be going places, my colostomy bag would fill up and I couldn't do anything. I'm just walking along supporting poo in my hand. Eventually, after a year, they did get an operation to get rid of the colostomy. once it was reversed, it took a while for it to heal. Sometimes the scar itself, it gets like it contracts and it tightens up and it really hurts. The more I think about it, the more I worry about it. I'm all on edge now. Honestly, you know what? I feel like it's braver for me not to carry a knife. It's that old habit of taking a knife everywhere. Take it to school, take it to college. It's not that I'd be using it all the time. It's just that you feel calm. That there is what I'm trying to be brave enough not to do. So I think that inside story of what it is to be somebody who has been affected by knife crime is incredibly moving, because I think it gives the sense that although as clinicians we may see saving somebody's life and getting their treatment started as the end of the story, it isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story, and very often it's a story that will go on for the rest of somebody's life. It may be a complication like a stoma, it may be pain, it may be all kinds of things, but for that person, the story is just beginning. And so I want to finish by talking about a project we're doing at the moment. It's called SHARP. SHARP is an acronym for Simulation-Based Holistic Approach for Reducing and Preventing Knife Violence. And the idea of this project is to work with young people aged 11 to 14 to try and find ways of preventing them from getting involved in knife violence in various ways, in gangs, in carrying knives, in getting involved in that kind of culture. We've been very fortunate in gaining funding from the Youth Endowment Fund, whose purpose, as it says on their website, is to prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence of all kinds. And of course, knife violence is one of those. And our aim is to work very closely, not only with young people, of course, but with schools and with communities and with charity partners. And we're working with two charity partners in particular. One is the Change Foundation, who for many years have been working with young people in schools, helping them through sport, particularly through netball, through football, and also particularly boxing. And the other one is the Prince's Trust, who for decades have been working with young people, more than 1 million of them now, as you can see from the image here, to help them make the best they possibly can of the potential that they've got. And so our aim here is to use what I've shown you around simulation as a means of working with young people as partners, as collaborators, not telling them what to do and what not to do, not just showing them stuff or doing things for them, but doing things with them, and using the flexibility of the simulation approaches I've shown you to be able to make changes, to be able to design things that bring together different perspectives, the perspectives that my colleagues and I have of working in hospitals, being clinicians. The perspectives that young people aged 11 to 14 have are completely different, of course, but they are no less expert. They are differently expert from our perspectives. And we see this as a process of what we're thinking of as reciprocal illumination, where everybody who takes part learns from the other people who are taking part, and where we don't start off with a fixed idea, but we try and work out how we can best collaborate with young people to come up with solutions that will go somewhere at least towards helping them from getting involved in this kind of world. And we use simulation of various kinds. We use the kind of physical simulation that I've been describing, and we were hoping to do a lot of that. But of course, over the last year, that's not been possible, like so many other things, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So although we hope to be able to do that again in a few months' time when things are more back to normal, we're also using approaches such as virtual reality. We're using some very innovative ideas around using experts from the visual arts to come up with ways to invite young people to express themselves through mark making, and a number of other approaches that we're developing as we go. So for us, this is a very exciting opportunity to work with young people themselves, to work with schools and community partners of various kinds, to try and come up collaboratively with ways of really doing something to reduce this awful sense that every day when we open our newspapers or turn on the news or look at a website, we're going to find another story of another young person who has been seriously injured, or even worse, lost their lives from knife injury. So I'm going to just pause at that point. I need to make a couple of acknowledgements, first of all, to the many colleagues and supporters who've been working with us over the last few years. My colleagues at Imperial, Fernando Bello, Natasha Houghton, Gabby Filmer-Pascoe, Agni Lahiri and Howard Tribe, who've been very much involved in the simulations I've described. Our funders, the Wellcome Trust, and of course now the Youth Endowment Fund, and our charity partners, the Change Foundation and the Prince's Trust. And having made those acknowledgements, I'm now going to open things up in a slightly different way, because it's a pleasure to introduce a colleague of mine who I've worked with for many, many years. He's now a consultant-level surgeon at Imperial College, and he works at the St Mary's Major Trauma Centre. But in addition to his clinical role, he's got a long-standing interest in simulation research. He's worked very closely with me on a number of the projects that I've just described. So please, would you welcome Mr. Sacha Harris. Sacha, very nice to have you here.
Thank you very much for asking me to join you, Roger.
So Sacha, I thought we could start off by catching up with what I was saying in the early part of my talk, when I was talking about my experience in Soweto in South Africa in the 1980s, with a high volume of patients coming in with injuries and having to operate on them, often at very short notice, and the story that I showed there. Now you're a surgeon who's working now in I suppose a way that's in some ways similar, in some ways very different. So first of all, could I just ask you just to introduce yourself, say a bit of what you do, and then I'm going to ask you to point out what you think the similarities and differences between our experiences might be.
Yes, of course. So I'm Sacha Harris. I'm a senior clinical fellow in upper GI surgery at Imperial College London. Prior to that, I did my higher surgical training on the North West Thames rotation, which included a couple of years on the general surgical rota at a major trauma centre, where we'd see up to 10 trauma calls per day. And we'd be involved in a team looking after those patients in the immediate phase as they walk in through the door in resus, all the way through an operation, potentially their recovery as well. During my time as a trainee, you were encouraged to do research, and I greatly enjoyed doing a master's with you, where we looked at simulation in surgical education. And I followed that up with a PhD looking at surgical expertise, where my postdoctoral research interests still lie.
Great. So when you say an upper GI surgery, for people who don't know, you're talking about what the intestinal surgery.
Yes, food pipe, stomach, small intestine.
So you're no stranger to food pipes, stomachs, and small intestines from the inside, obviously. But the kind of perspective that I showed there was when those parts of the body particularly had been injured and things. So tell me what would happen now if you were in the position I was in 30 years ago or whatever, and a patient comes in with a penetrating wound. You're in a hospital in central London. How does it work?
So we're very fortunate in that we have very organised training in this, both on an individual and organisational level. So you are expected as a surgical registrar to attend every 4 years a mandatory trauma training course. And this has evolved since the 1970s, such that we now recognise what is the greatest threat to life and learn how to treat them in order, the A, B, C that our audience will know. When we first became a major trauma centre at St Mary's, just as you demonstrated very eloquently in your talk, we hadn't much experience of doing this, not in a formal way. And therefore, it was important to have an opportunity to practice without that responsibility to the patient. And so the organisation sets up these training situations and revalidation courses for us, all based around a curriculum that's set centrally. And when the bleep goes off, people mobilise from far and wide around a hospital. There is a trauma team leader within resus, separate to the A&E staff, who is purely there for trauma calls. And they are the ones stood at the end of the bed, giving people roles and basically helping decide that patient's care management.
Oh, so you've got somebody who isn't rushing in and doing things, who's standing back and seeing the whole picture.
Yeah, and that's really important, to detach yourself from it. I think if you've got that opportunity to see the overview, rather than having to do every single thing for oneself, it gives you a much better understanding of
that's
what's
an
going
interesting
on.
one, isn't it? Because it's not something that I mean, certainly from my experience when I was learning to do this kind of surgery, the temptation was to see a problem and try and fix it. And sometimes over-focus, I think,
Correct.
on one particular injury like that.
Yeah.
And I saw,
It can be very distracting, actually.
Yes, it
when
can be.
Actually, the greatest threat to someone's life is always going to be their airway and then their breathing,
And you
followed by
can
their
lose sight of that,
circulation.
can't you? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this is a way of making, of separating that role of standing back and looking all around at the whole thing from the other bits that need to be done. Is that right?
Yes, using a structured approach as you do so.
Yeah.
And there'll be an anaesthetist, someone who's used to looking after airways at the top end. You'll have someone who's proficient in ATLS and their airway breathing circulation approach, doing what we call a primary survey, looking at each of those individual organ systems systematically, one by one. You'll have nursing colleagues who'll be setting up monitoring, administering medications as they're prescribed. You might even have junior medical team members who are scribing for you, so there's a record of what's happened to this individual as they've gone through. And then, of course, you've got the specialty team who'll be stood behind a line on the floor, invited to step forward when the moment comes, who might be from neurosurgery in the head, cardiothoracics for the chest, my area, general surgery for the abdomen, orthopedics for pelvis and long bone injuries. Because you don't know what's come through, and you have to stratify their injuries according to order of importance or risk to life and limb.
So when you say you don't know what's happening, I mean, certainly when I was doing this kind of, providing this kind of care, you really didn't know. I mean, we had one or two investigations we could do. You could do X-ray, chest X-rays and things to make sure that people's lungs hadn't been collapsed and things, because that would have an implication for anesthesia and things. But more or less, it was a question of operating on people and looking directly to see what was damaged and trying to put it right. But of course, that was 30 years ago, and many things have changed since then. And one of them, I guess, is other forms of finding out what's going on inside somebody without having to open them up and have a look.
Yes, that's right. So we're very fortunate now. A member of our trauma team at St Mary's that I haven't mentioned is actually a radiologist. So perhaps 30 years ago, the only way to know what was going on was to look inside and make a big cut on the abdomen and rummage around. Whereas these days, a radiologist attends, we can get an ultrasound at the bedside, look at the heart, the lungs, we can look at where fluid collects within the abdomen if it shouldn't be there. We can get X-rays taken in the resus bays. And the trauma team, in a stable or stably unstable patient, can be escorted around to imaging facilities such as CT, where we have much greater access to these, often on the same level as resus, perhaps even en route to the operating theatre, but just so that we can help hone our ideas of what might be wrong and what would be the best approach to treat it.
So you've got a much better idea of the physical side of what's probably going on inside. But I guess you have the same issue that I had of people coming in often critically ill and needing immediate treatment, and you don't really know very much about them, or their personalities, or their communities, or anything else at that stage. Is that fair to say?
It is. And we have a team on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in order to answer those sorts of calls. And we're fortunate if HEMS or the London Ambulance Service call through a red call, we can get a team together in a matter of seconds or minutes. But sometimes you also have people who just walk in off the street. We call them the mistrauma calls, where someone has to recognise that someone is that unwell or potentially that unwell in order to bring that group of people together, each with a slightly different ability or skill set. But when you put the sum of those parts together, they're greater than those of the individual alone.
So you were saying that you've experienced different forms of simulation, really, as a means of training.
Yes.
Yes. And so what sort of things do you think you can train in simulation? And what sort of things... Because, I mean, simulation is never going to be exactly the same as the real thing, is it? It can get quite close in some ways, maybe less so in others. Where do you think its strengths lie?
So I think it's horses for courses. If you've got a junior trainee who's not done something at all before, it's an opportunity to get familiar maybe with the instruments, maybe with the steps of the procedure and the techniques involved, rather than giving them a patient to practice on. And that practice without responsibility is something they can do in their own time once someone has guided them through it. I certainly have suture packs at home that I remember practicing on when I was in my earlier days. But I think as you get older, you need a sense of immersion. And the cues that we brought in through distributed simulation, through hybrid simulation, through the sequence of simulations, gave us just enough of those cues to make it feel real, that that nervous energy as you're doing something, the not knowing as you go
it's
and
the
do
not knowing,
something.
isn't it? I mean, there is that uncertainty, isn't it? I mean, certainly I found in trauma surgery, one of the things I learnt fairly early on is that it was dangerous to make assumptions about what you were going to find, because a tiny little wound on the surface could mean really bad things deep
Absolutely
inside,
right.
or a great big enormous wound with gut spilling out, like that unsettling picture I showed, could actually not be all that serious. It might be that there was a superficial cut, and once you had a look, not much deep damage. So you couldn't really, it was dangerous to make assumptions.
Yes.
And you had to keep your wits about you and make sure that you didn't miss things. I found that, and I'm not sure if that resonates with you now.
Very much so. I think I'm fortunate to work in the days where we do have such great access to technology, imaging, at the bedside or close by. But we also have the opportunity with things like minimally invasive surgery. If things are equivocal, yes, you can continue to examine your patient and monitor them, but you also have the opportunity to look inside with a telescope.
So this is keyhole surgery.
Keyhole
we're talking about,
surgery.
yeah. So instead of opening somebody up in the way that I was showing, you would
Yeah.
just put in a little camera.
Correct. And there are hard and fast rules around some of these things, but there are grey areas too. And each of that is down to the subjective nature of what's walked down and sat in front of you. But also you work as part of a team and be able to talk to each other, to have a trauma team leader, a surgeon,
Yeah,
a radiologist, put their heads together and think what's best for that patient in a very demanding situation, has shown demonstrably improved outcomes.
So I was going to ask you about that business of the team, because certainly in my experience, the team to me was very much the surgical team, and of course the nurses looking after patients afterwards. But then, as I said, patients when they left hospital would go back into this huge city almost of its own, and I wouldn't see them again. But now it's very different, isn't it? And I know there are many members of the wider team in trauma centres now, particularly thinking right from the beginning about what the patient's experience is going to be from the moment they start to recover onwards.
Yeah, and a lot of that is based on experience not only in our own centre but taken from elsewhere, and trauma networks that put their data together. But it's a very coordinated approach, and we mentioned all of the people as someone walks in through the front door, but there's also then the operating team. You alluded to it in some of the simulations with the anaesthetic, the surgeon, the scrub team, the porters bringing blood and blood products, the haematologist in the lab. And then in the recovery phase, or what we hope is a recovery phase, there'll be intensive care teams, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, social services, safeguarding advocates, all of whom have to work together in a holistic manner in order to coordinate that patient's care, not just for them, but also their loved ones, people who might be put at risk around them, but all in the hope that they won't come back to us as a patient again, I suppose.
Yeah, because I think, certainly it seemed to me that with the work that we did with the young people at Haggerston Park, for example, and at that time, that a lot of young people had the sense that if you got stabbed, you might die, or you might live. But if you survived, then you'd be back to being as good as new. You go back to where you were before you were stabbed. But actually, that's usually not the case, is it? It's very often the case that an injury like that leads to long-term effects, and so the process of care isn't just getting somebody well enough to leave hospital a week after they've had an injury, but it's something that's going to go on and on and on. And bringing these different parts of these different sort of experts in the system to bear, and it might be physiotherapists, it might be occupational therapists, the people you've talked about, but it might also be other people in the community, and different forms of support. That's all part of a complex picture, isn't it?
Very much so. And I think what we found very powerful when we did these simulations wasn't just to go in, deliver it and walk away, but it was to have those conversations with the people who'd attended. And they would have the opportunity to talk with a real-life paramedic, a police officer, a scrub nurse, a stoma nurse, a victim, of knife crime who's actually gone through that process. And we'd spend hours talking to them, trying to work out what it was they'd taken away, not just educationally, but maybe behaviourally from what they'd seen. And we had individuals contact us at later dates asking to come and do work experience, to come and see what it's like from the other side, so that it's not just a lecture. It isn't a demonstration, but it's that two-way process.
Exactly, I think that's what I meant. And that's what I meant about the reciprocal illumination, the idea that I think whoever you are, you have as much to learn from the other people who are in a different part of the picture as you do from the people whose work is most close to your own. And that idea that by working, in our case, with this current project, by working with young people much younger than the ones we've often worked with before, we can perhaps try and get a bit of a better sense of what the world looks like through their eyes, and hope that they'll get a better sense of what the world looks like through our eyes, and that by collaborating on creating simulations, we may be able to have a sort of focus for doing that, because then we can see how each of us would make changes to what's already there to make it more authentic or seem more like it really is for them. And I think that's an interesting idea, isn't it? Because very often I think simulation is seen as a way of providing something that people can then go through and practice stuff, but the simulation itself is kind of fixed. Whereas what we've been talking about is about having fluid, changeable settings that everybody can contribute to and everybody can make, can adjust.
Yes, I think the timeline we demonstrated of how our work has evolved was very apt. And certainly over the last 18 months through COVID, it's forced us to innovate. There were things that we weren't anticipating either wanting or necessarily needing to do. But that's an opportunity. And there are people, as you say, already doing these wonderful things out there that we are now in touch with, that we're collaborating with. And each of these different groups with their own experiences, when they work together, make it very powerful. But the key concept, I think, just before COVID happened was recognising that we had to go to these groups. We were presenting at science fairs and Imperial Open Days. But actually, perhaps the people who had the most to gain were unaware of our work or didn't have access to it. And so by having mobile simulation or online and virtual reality opportunities, that's probably more accessible to the demographic that we need to target in order to reach out to them and work with them in the next phase of our work.
Yeah, but I think also this idea that there are two systems here. There's the medical system, which we've been focusing on almost exclusive, well, certainly the last hour, that's what we've been talking about. But there's also the other side of things, because if you're carrying a knife, or somebody's carrying a knife, you could get stabbed. But when I started looking at this, I discovered that most people who get stabbed are stabbed with the knife they are themselves carrying. And so the line between being stabbed or stabbing somebody is very, very narrow, isn't it? And so when there are knives in the picture, you could be injured yourself, in which case you go down this medical path. You could injure somebody else, in which case it's a very different path. It's arrest, it's remand, it's court, it's prison, all those things. It's the criminal justice system. And so I suppose, being aware of those two sides to the picture and how easy it is to flip between one and the other when there's a fraught situation and people are sort of, as we heard from that, I think that very moving account of the young man who was saying that he felt safe with a knife, although he'd rather not have one. All those things. There are a lot of mixed emotions out there and mixed feelings.
Yes, and it's a really valid point. It's, our medical pathway is what we know and are familiar with and can demonstrate, but by working with partners who have experience from the other side, from perhaps the assailant side, there is another story to be told. And again, having those people at these simulations, talking to someone off the record, just understanding what might happen, what might occur, what if it's me, is very powerful. And over a period of time, when we spoke with these adolescents that we worked with in Haggerston Park and elsewhere, we found that did stay with them.
So I suppose, we in the last couple of minutes, really, Sasha, I wanted to think about then how in the medical world we might start to think more widely and sort of keep in balance the need to attend to people in the moment who are critically ill and, of course, need a lot of specialised care, but also think about how life is going to play out for those people as they start to recover, as they start to get back to as close as they can to the life they were living before. And really, it seems to me that one of the challenges is to bring these different parts of the picture together and sort of weave them into a story that makes sense for everybody who takes part, so that it's not just the clinicians or the healthcare professionals or the criminal justice people or the patients in separate categories, but we put the picture together so we can get an insight into what it's like for the people who really are most affected by these horrible injuries.
Yes, very much so. Prevention obviously would be preferable to cure, which is where our work currently has sat. But no, it's an important part of the narrative that we engage with these people in this population to help them going forwards.
So we could go on for a very long time, but we've pretty much run out of time, Sasha. So Sasha Harris, thank you very much for taking part in this conversation. And I think it's now time to open up the conversation to a wider audience.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Kneebone, and thank you very much, Sasha Harris, for joining us. This really, really interesting and sometimes quite disturbing subject, actually. But we have a few questions. The first one is a question about whether you did any impact measurement of the simulation, at the NEC and at Haggerston.
Well, the answer is yes, isn't it? I mean, certainly the Haggerston one, perhaps. Sasha, do you want to respond to that one?
Yeah, data collection when you're doing public engagement is difficult, as I'm sure you're aware. We were working with children under the age of 16, so there were ethical issues around that. We needed parental consent, school consent to go and work where we did. But what we asked for were volunteers who would be contacted at various time points with a series of questions set by an educational psychologist looking at both the educational and behavioural value of the simulations that we put forward, as well as suggestions by the participant as to what else they particularly enjoyed or what they might have liked to have seen instead, so that we could not only evaluate the work that we were doing at that moment in time over a series of time points, but also what we might want to do as the work evolved going forwards. And the Haggerston Park work actually evolved into something we did with the Saracens Hits programme, where we had greater access to youth who were already perhaps excluded from school or on the verge of exclusion from school, on juvenile programmes and schemes that would try and remove them from a difficult environment. And everything that was found out at Haggerston was then used to employ with our work with Saracens.
And that was very interesting, I think, in helping us recognise the importance of collecting information. And so the project that I mentioned that we're doing at the moment, the SHARP project, funded by the Youth Endowment Fund, includes a component of independent evaluation by a group of specialists who will be looking in great detail at the work that we're doing and the responses of the various different people who are part of the picture, the young people themselves, of course, but also the schools, the charity partners, the communities that they're in, and trying to build up a richer sense, actually, of what this kind of approach might, what its strengths and limitations might be. And I think that that's a really crucial part, isn't it? Because it's easier to come up with ideas for engaging people than to really know the details of what effect they're having.
Yes.
I think it's a very interesting question.
Thank you very much. The next question is about the police, and the questioner would like to know whether the police have been involved in your simulation work, and if so, whether they think it's beneficial.
Yeah, the police absolutely have been involved in our simulation work. We've as I showed in that example from the Big Bang Fair at the National Exhibition Centre, we've involved police in a number of our scenarios, because that's an important part. One of the things we wanted to get over to people was sort of practical issues around if you're involved, if somebody near you is stabbed or you yourself are, what are the things you need to do to make sure that everybody's safe? What is the information that you need to give to the police or to the emergency services? What kind of things should you take into account if there is potential danger around? And so we've worked with the police a lot in that way. We've also been working with quite senior people in the police services and the Crown Prosecution Service and various parts of the judicial system to see if there are ways that we can bring their perspectives into the story, to widen it out, as I say, from purely looking at the medical side to looking at what are the possibilities, the possible directions that things might go in if there is a situation involving a knife or knives. There are obviously issues around the police when it comes to sometimes issues around trust and relationships between different communities and the police, and it's quite a complex area that I think requires great sensitivity and a lot of thought, a lot of discussion, and a lot of sort of consultation. But I think that it's clearly a crucially important part of the whole picture.
Thank you very much. And just one more question here, and it's a very interesting one. It's something that struck me actually as well. The questioner asks, the number of clinicians who are needed around a patient with a stab wound suggests that this is an extremely expensive type of surgery. Is there any interest from funders, NHS, foundations, etc., in investing more for measures that will reduce the number of stabbings on this basis?
Well, it's a fair point. I think there's an extraordinary amount of personnel and resources employed when a trauma or what we call a code red comes in, where it's a life-threatening emergency. I think, I'm not a politician, so it's difficult to comment about funding and resources at my level. But I think what we're doing on the simulation side and with our research is to try and get at the grassroots level and educate people about things that happen behind closed doors.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it is true. Of course, it's resource intensive, but it's an investment, isn't it, in looking at the whole person and not just. I mean, all the things you've been talking about, all the rehabilitation, all the many different specialist services that come in, all these things are crucial. And I think if we're to get people, as many people as possible, back to living as full a life as they possibly can after this kind of injury, we absolutely need to invest in having the right members of the team, the right sort of areas of specialist expertise that we can draw on. And I think you just have to think about what you would feel like if it was you or a member of your family or somebody you knew, and you would absolutely want them to have every possible form of support in getting back to normal or as close to normal as possible. As quickly as you can, and of course there are resource implications, but I think that's part of the wider, as you say, the wider sort of economic and political picture that we have to take into account.
Yes.
Well, thank you again, Professor Kneebone, and thank you very much, Sasha Harris, for your participation this evening.
Thank you.
I'm just going to take the opportunity to say a few words about Professor Kneebone. I should have really introduced myself before. My name is Simon Thurley and I'm the Provost of Gresham College. And this evening we are actually saying goodbye, hopefully not forever, to Professor Kneebone, who's been a visiting professor at the college for the last 3 years. And in that time he's provided us with 3 absolutely fascinating and actually I think extremely original series of lectures. His first series in 2018-19 about medical education and training explored the non-traditional aspects of medical education through training and performance. His focus on the performance of medicine connected with actors, musicians, craftsmen, dancers and other experts. And we were reminiscing before this lecture about the grand piano that you had to get onto the stage at the Museum of London during that great series. Your second series, Reframing Medical Education, which you gave in 2019 to 2020, explored topics such as keyhole surgery pioneers and what medicine can learn from restaurants about care. And this year, we've had performing medicine, performing surgery. And this sort of concluded your gripping explanation of non-traditional aspects of medical education. And your guests have included a polar explorer, a fighter pilot. I found that particularly interesting. And actually, I just remembered the other one, which was great, was a Savile Row tailor, who you also introduced. So we've had a really fascinating time, and you've introduced us to many other experts as you have been speaking. And I assume that some of this has come from your book, which was published in 2020, called Expert: Understanding the Path to Mastery. Throughout your time here at Gresham, you have brought your considerable knowledge to bear on a really wide range of subjects, and the way you've joined up subjects that I think to most of us have seemed completely disconnected has been absolutely fascinating. So we at the college, and also your extensive audience who's been listening to these lectures, both in person and online, would like to thank you very much for all you've done for the last 3 years, and I very much hope we'll be able to invite you back in the future. Thank you so much.
Simon, thank you so much for those kind words. It's been a pleasure and an honour to have the opportunity to give these lectures and to engage with such a wide audience. So thank you so much.
It's our pleasure.